Bueno, muchas gracias. Bueno, mi nombre es Sandra Fernández, soy directora del Centro Científico Tecnológico CONICET Rosario y de la Unidad Ejecutora ISHIR. Bienvenidos a estas segundas Jornadas Nacionales de Antropología del Trabajo para los que formamos parte de la Unidad Ejecutora ISHIR. Es realmente no solo un placer, sino un orgullo que las jornadas se realicen en el marco de nuestro instituto. Y por otro lado, señalar que la antropología del trabajo es una de las líneas centrales de investigación de nuestra unidad ejecutora, es una de las líneas que nutre, digamos, las acciones y la generación de formación de recursos humanos, nuevas líneas de investigación y también problemáticas de vinculación tecnológica, que esto es importante señalarlo, digamos. Esta línea tiene también una política muy importante de vinculación con asociaciones sindicales, asociaciones de base y gobiernos municipales, que marcan justamente este triángulo virtuoso que hace la investigación, que es formación de recursos, investigación de base y vinculación con el medio. Desde ya auguro que van a ser unas jornadas sumamente importantes, sumamente fructíferas, y espero que los materiales y la producción que se va a desarrollar a lo largo de estas jornadas pueda ser también publicada como una de las herramientas centrales de divulgación o de alta divulgación científica, o como le querramos llamar, de comunicación de la ciencia en su conjunto por parte de nuestra unidad ejecutora. Así que nuevamente felicitar a los organizadores por todo el esfuerzo que demanda este tipo de acciones, que quizás no se visibilizan lo suficiente, pero resultan sumamente importantes para poder mantener viva estas líneas de investigación, en particular en los tiempos tan trágicos, y utilizo esta palabra con el sentido literal, tan trágicos que nos toca transitar. Así que nuevamente, muchísimas gracias a todos, a todos, a todas por estar participando de estas jornadas, por acompañarnos y éxitos en todas las sesiones y en todos los distintos espacios de trabajo. Muchísimas gracias. Procedo a Julia.
Gracias, Sandra, por favor. Bueno, vamos entonces a dar comienzo a esta conferencia inaugural de las jornadas de Antropología del Trabajo, a esta segunda jornada de Antropología del Trabajo. Tenemos el gusto, el honor de que nos acompañe Sharryn Kasmir, que es, bueno, antropóloga, trabaja en la Universidad Hofstra en Nueva York, eh, y ha desarrollado una línea de investigación en antropología del trabajo que entendemos que dialoga y que alimenta muy fructíferamente nuestras propias investigaciones, nuestras propias inquietudes, y que está vinculada con esto de poder pensar diálogos entre la antropología del trabajo y la crítica de la economía política o la economía política. Conocimos a Sharryn a través de otra referente en este campo, al menos para nosotros, en estas latitudes del sur, que es Jung Nash, en ocasión de algunos intercambios por la traducción del texto Hegemonía Empresaria, en el original From Think Tank to High Tech, que realizamos hace ya como 10 años en el marco del grupo de Antropología del Trabajo, donde estábamos todos los mayorcitos de este ambiente, de este aula. Y a partir de ahí, bueno, empezamos este diálogo más que fructífero en estos cruces y en estas intersecciones, en poder pensar cómo los campos de estudio, de abordaje de la antropología del trabajo se van constituyendo mutuamente en ámbitos, en espacios institucionales y en contextos diversos, y cómo van también emergiendo y entrecruzando preocupaciones y preguntas teóricas que son comunes en muchos casos. Bueno, en el caso del trabajo de Sharryn, vamos a escuchar ahora su conferencia, y por qué, vamos a ver ahí por qué nos resulta tan relevante y tan inspirador, pero es parte de un conjunto de trabajos en donde justamente pone a dialogar estas categorías más, si se quiere, generales, que provienen del campo de la crítica de la economía política, de la geografía crítica, y de otras disciplinas en un contexto, en contextos etnográficos y de producción antropológica. Categorías como valor, como desposesión, como desarrollo desigual y combinado, son trabajadas y son recuperadas y puestas justamente en vínculo con la producción antropológica de una manera, bueno, además de sólida digamos, y contundente, de una manera que nos ayuda a iluminar, nos ayuda a pensar y nos ayuda a reponer un campo de la antropología del trabajo que pueda colaborar eficientemente en dar respuestas a, a, a estos interrogantes más generales y en relación con estos procesos más generales que estamos atravesando como sociedades y como trabajadores y trabajadoras. Y en ese marco me parece que, bueno, poder abrirnos y poder pensar en cómo enganchar, en cómo entramar estas categorías con las propias dinámicas de conocimiento situado más propias de la antropología, es una tarea que tenemos por delante, que está siempre abierta y que necesitamos consolidar día a día. Así que, sin más, los dejo con nuestra conferencista en esta conferencia que se llama Antropología del Trabajo, trayectorias. ¿Qué pasa? No, bueno, era el título de la trayectorias. Me olvidé. Se me fue, perdón, perdón. Conceptos, debates y trayectorias. Siempre me olvido el orden de los factores, pero bueno. La antropología del trabajo, conceptos, debates, trayectorias, con ustedes, Sharryn.
Yeah. Yeah, yo. Okay. Thank you. Gracias por invitarme. Thank you, Julia. And thank you to everybody for inviting me. It really is my honor to be here. And I'm excited to talk to you and to also hear what your concerns are and questions are. So I'll try to keep my talk relatively brief, a little bit more than half an hour so that we have time to engage. So I've been asked to talk today about the anthropology of labor, and specifically to share the Marxist perspective or the political economy contribution that I've been elaborating for more than 2 decades. So today I'm first going to recall the historical moment and the theoretical impulse that gave birth to that perspective. That was an impulse to me as I was dealing with questions of the day. And then I'm going to discuss my current fieldwork and events during the COVID pandemic in the US to kind of show this theory in action, to show how I think with it. So I hope this will be useful and we can talk. So I conducted fieldwork in a unionized UAW General Motors auto factory in the last year of the 20th century, so 1999. The facility, that factory, which at the time was the largest investment in an industrial space in US history, was built in the non-union U.S. South. The South of the United States is notoriously non-union, precisely when auto factories were closing in Detroit, Flint, and other more northern union strongholds. That is, I saw the long dispossession of US auto workers and the intimate connections between wages and wagelessness. So dislocation and job loss for some with new work for others. So I saw a so-called labor aristocracy mutually constituted by the impoverishment and dislocation of other workers. And I'll say, because Julia brought it up, that I was a student of June Nash's at the time, and she precisely was writing Tanktown to High Tech during my graduate years, so about 10 years before I wrote this work. So I'm very heavily influenced by that perspective. But it was really David Harvey's A Brief History of Neoliberalism that helped me conceptualize what was happening in the US in this auto space, auto factory. In that book, Harvey developed the concept of accumulation by dispossession, which I think you all know something about. And he used that concept to describe the multifaceted offensive launched by capital via neoliberal state policy. Neoliberalism was a fix, to use Harvey's framing, to capture declining profitability, to recapture declining profitability. So dispossession quickly became a very valuable concept for political economy-minded anthropologists. It allowed us to capture the connections between many disparate global occurrences. At the time, we were seeing privatization of water in highland Bolivia, the liberalization of ejidos in Mexico, post-Soviet desocialization, the dismantling of social protections in Europe, and an assault on unions everywhere, including in the US, where I was doing research at the time. Dispossession referred to what capital and states were doing to privatize, enclose, commodify, and separate working people from land, forms of livelihood, and hard-won labor rights and state protections. But that term did little to tell us about global working classes in and for themselves. That is, about the on-the-ground realities of working lives, consciousness, and struggle. Since dispossession was unfolding globally, it might well have helped us stitch together many simultaneous disruptions. To use Julia Sohl and Agustin Santella's astute framing, it might have helped us theorize the relationship between dispossession, commodification, and exploitation, and the diverse struggles against them. However, Harvey did the opposite. He wrote that dispossessed workers in the global north engaged in backward-looking defensive struggles, while social movements waged progressive struggles in the global south. When Harvey turned from capital accumulation to politics, in effect, he discovered nothing more than the very divisions etched by capital. He didn't get us out of those capitalist etched divisions. He re-articulated them. Political proclivities aside, whether the struggles are retrograde or progressive, and we can discuss that, what the general concept of dispossession should have done was to help us draw connections between these disparate movements and the many ways people's lives were being disrupted and disorganized worldwide. It should have been a sharp political tool. And August Carbonella, my co-author, and I took that as our remit for what we began to call the Anthropology of Labor. What did neoliberal dispossession do to working classes on a global scale? How were working people responding, and what kind of politics might result? In developing the Anthropology of Labor, we identified 4 core processes for elaboration. And you would have read about these in the article, I think, that you read, our short article that you read. So the first, disorganization, the systematic disempowerment of working people through the loss or destruction of their organizations, forms of protest, and ways of life. This disorganization deeply changes the collective conditions of existence. Again, Sol and Santella developed the concept further, writing that the notion of disorganization is critical for identifying ruptures between the lived experiences and mental class maps and the historical formations that gave rise to them. Second, difference. When dispossession happens, whether privatization of ejidos or a factory closing, it does not wash evenly over communities. Rather, it creates new divisions and exacerbates old ones, in particular along lines of race, gender, nationality, etc. Disposition creates difference. Third, unevenness. Against the neoliberal dogma, I think that we've all gotten rid of by now, but we had at the time, against the neoliberal dogma that capitalism is a homogenizing force, it always creates difference and unevenness. The seesaw movement of investment and disinvestment incorporates some people, some economic sectors, some places for some periods of time, and it marginalizes others. The terrain of unevenness is precisely the lifeblood of capital accumulation. It is the stuff of future profit. 4, labor is a political formation. We underscored how states and capital name, divide, or unify, value or devalue various kinds of work, and how actors and organizations respond in ways that shape political outcomes. We treated labor as a political formation, constituted by historically shifting relationships in a broader field of power. We therefore distinguished between labor and class. Sola and Santella underscore the point. The link between labor and working class has to be theorized in a more complex way. For us, labor referred to the total effort of social reproduction, including that which is waged and unwaged, visible and made visible, visible and made invisible, formal and informal, contractually free, coerced, or bonded. From this starting point, that the totality, we asked how different kinds of labors were named and recognized, and we closely examined the ways some were counted in while others counted out in the making of class. These were the concepts that anchored the research program for the Anthropology of Labor we set out in the book, Blood and Fire, A Global Anthropology of Labor. And you've read our short translated chapter, Disposición, Desorganización y la Antropología del Trabajo, that presents much of the argument. Our title, Blood and Fire, was a tribute to Marx's chapter in Capital on primitive accumulation. Harvey's accumulation by dispossession, taking from Rosa Luxemburg, updated this notion of primitive or original accumulation. He affirmed that it is a persistent feature of capitalism, not a one-time occurrence dating to the transition to capitalism. And this argument is rehearsed again in Nancy Fraser's Cannibal Capitalism. We intended that our close examination of dispossession in the lives of working people in discrete places, linked by hidden relations among them, would open questions about actual and possible alliances, organizations, and protests. For insight, we drew upon Silvia Federici's The Caliban and the Witch. In Federici's telling, in 15th century Europe, wagelessness was the common experience for diverse laborers thrown into market dependence. That is, wagelessness and not the wage. This was the signal social relation of capitalism. As Federici told it, the imposition of the wage cleaved a proletariat that had become restless and increasingly forceful. The wage divided men from women in 16th century Europe and European proletarians from enslaved people in the colonies. Federici traced a relationship between emerging proletarian power and elite backlash, and she wrote that the accumulation of labor is the accumulation of differences, of which racialization and gender inequality were primary mechanisms. So that's the skeleton of the anthropology of labor. It rehearses what you read in that article. The hardest part, that is future possible scenarios for labor politics, was not as richly developed in that book and our subsequent work, as were the histories of working class disorganization. In the rest of my talk, I want to turn to my current research in a Rust Belt city in the US to broach these political questions, and in the context of our current election results. You can imagine how important it is to take a look at these questions. Okay, I'm just going to check in on and see if we're going well and you're hearing me and the translation's going well. Yeah? Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so during the pandemic, I was conducting fieldwork in the city of Reading, Pennsylvania, and the surrounding suburban and rural county of Berks, so Reading and Berks County. I'm just repeating that because it'll come up later, and it's funny. It's a funny word, Berks. Reading has 95,000 residents, and it's a deindustrializing, financially distressed city. Reading also has a majority Latino population. 66% of the population officially is Latino. It's probably more. And it's made up primarily of Puerto Ricans who migrated to the city in the 1970s, either from Puerto Rico directly or from New York City, and Dominicans and Mexicans who began arriving in the 1990s. Reading was a railroad and industrial powerhouse and a union stronghold in the 20th century, but capital abandonment disorganized the city's working class that had been predominantly white until approximately 1970s or so. In the long wake of union decline, social movement organizations are building a liberal left political counterforce in what is a predominantly Republican voting and Trump supporting county, with right-wing groups that reinforce that political tendency. I studied two groups that are central to the left liberal political effort. One is Berks Stands Up, and it was launched in 2020 after Trump's first presidential victory to promote political engagement. It's a chapter of the progressive coalition Pennsylvania Stands Up, which, by the way, supported Bernie Sanders in 2020. And that represents urban, suburban, and rural districts across the state. I also studied Make the Road Reading, which was founded in 2014 in the city. And that's a chapter of a multi-state NGO whose mission is to build power in Latino immigrant working class communities. Separately and together, their organizing spans a gamut of issues and campaigns, from preventing the privatization of a publicly owned unionized nursing home, care home, to mobilizing against Donald Trump's election bids. I touch on two small examples of their organizing in what follows. And again, this is during COVID. So the multi-pronged crisis sparked by the pandemic deepened in existing inequalities and mobilized new ones. In the United States, inequalities of race, gender, immigration status, and skill were exacerbated, and new divisions were called forth and naturalized. Those included essential and essential, in-person, remote, protected, unprotected. Shelter in place and stay-at-home orders shuttered many workplaces, while healthcare, energy, transport, agriculture, food production, etc., were designated essential and remained open. This state of affairs had disproportionate impacts on people of color, Indigenous people, and immigrants, who were more likely to be essential frontline workers and therefore to suffer higher rates of COVID-19 infection and death. At the same time, they were harder hit by mass unemployment and less likely to qualify for state-issued benefits. That is, labor was named, categorized, valued, and devalued by the state and capital in plain sight. With the COVID-19 emergency in full force, Pennsylvania Stands Up, so one of my two groups, held a virtual panel on Zoom about the then erupting struggles in food packing warehouses across the country. The topic of essential workers provoked sharp debate among the panelists. One of those panelists was an organizer from the Democratic Socialists of America Party. That's a Democratic Socialist Party we have in the country, a minority party that doesn't run people for office, but is a kind of protest party, and the union-backed Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee. The organizer made the case that the designation essential was offered an opportunity for strategic, nimble labor actions. Strikes and work stoppages in critical sectors, such as food and energy, or at transportation nodes, could disrupt supply chains. Waves of strikes at pivotal points could inflict serious economic damage. Wildcat actions at fruit and vegetable warehouses in Washington state, that's on the west coast of the United States, suggested a strategy. Beginning on May Day, the farm workers, Unión Familias Unidas por la Justicia, called strikes across multiple employers, demanding hazard pay and safer working conditions. Yakima County in Washington had the highest COVID rate on the West Coast when the wildcats began. Familias Unidas reported that the protests were led by women and that participants were multiracial and multi-generational. The job actions targeted food distribution at a time when the global supply chain was already vulnerable. Meat packing and poultry processing plants across the country were COVID hotspots. For that reason, Make the Road Ready, my group, led a May Day car caravan. We drove in a caravan to protest at nearby processing plants. And we drove in this caravan because it wasn't safe at that point to join together in an in-person protest. So we drove on a car caravan to nearby processing plants for chicken, where several of Make the Road members worked and were sickened with COVID. And in fact, 2 of their family members died as a result of their becoming infected. As an emergency measure, some US meatpacking facilities shut down. The Guardian newspaper reported that the supply chain had gotten so tight that when only 2 plants went down, fully 10% of national pork production was knocked down. Then President Trump feared that meat shortages would create unrest, and he invoked the Defense Production Act, a military act, to order the plants to reopen. The EWOC, the organizer, the union political party organizer on the panel, urged that at this unique moment when supply chains were imperiled a chokehold initiative could seed a union resurgence and even spark a reversal of decades of union decline in the United States. He thought that people would really just would be mobilized to unionize. He argued that the classification essential workers created a target for high-impact strikes that could do real harm to employers and to the national economy and could mobilize a strategic sector of the working class. He warned that the time was short, perhaps only weeks, to launch a choke point offensive and win power for organized labor. But his co-panelist, who is the director of a national NGO that advocates for restaurant workers, vigorously objected. She insisted that the label essential valorized some kind of labor while it marginalized others, and it erased household and community care. Thus, it replayed historic gender and race hierarchies that long devalued service and care work in the United States. Restaurant workers suffered mass unemployment during the pandemic, but many did not receive unemployment benefits because their $2.38-hour sub-minimum wage, they get to be paid below the federal minimum wage because they also make tips, meant that they earned too little to qualify for benefits. This sub-minimum wage category that kind of takes servers out of the minimum wage regulation dates to the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act, which was part of the social welfare package called the New Deal. It was our first set of legislated federal labor protections. But tipped domestic and farm work were exempted from minimum wage laws and remain so to this day. The exclusion was initially a compromise with Southern US legislators who wanted to retain control over a cheap, racialized, and gendered regional labor force. The histories of slavery, sharecropping, and Black women's unpaid domestic service were thus embedded in the labor hierarchies etched by state labor protections. The panelists considered that the present-day evocation of essential rehearsed the New Deal segmentation of the US working class into differently recognized, protected, and imperiled fractions. She rejected the chokehold initiative, and that used that designation. Responding to the needs of displaced restaurant servers, her NGO raised millions of dollars in donations and gained 170,000 new contacts. And she wanted to use those resources to pursue the organization's lobbying efforts to press legislators in Congress and the Senate to increase the federal minimum wage, currently at $7.25 to $15 an hour, and to include all workers, including tipped servers, in that equation. So clearly, urgent problems of inclusion and exclusion, recognition and erasure came to the fore for the Reddingburg social movement groups that I was studying. And they did again just weeks later during a legislative congressional fight over a federal pandemic relief package. The US Senate debated a pandemic relief bill in July of 2020 when key provisions of the Trump administration's $2 trillion CARES Act were to expire. So we had this stimulus package and they were about to expire. The CARES Act had given billions to corporations, but only a maximum of $1,200 to taxpayers and a $600 per week federal temporary unemployment supplement was reserved for those who earned sufficient income from legally sanctioned employment. That was about to end, and the fight was over that set of benefits. But even in that $600 per week unemployment supplement, people without a Social Security or tax identification number, sub-minimum wage earners, and those in the formal economy did not qualify. So many immigrant households were locked out of unemployment benefits and cash disbursements. A proposed second relief package was again going to do the same work of marginalizing those people. So immigrant rights groups mobilized. Make the Road launched a campaign to pressure senators to assist all workers, regardless of immigration status. And individual members pleaded their case with video testimonials posted to Make the Road's Facebook page. One video featured Maria, a middle-aged woman who migrated from Mexico to Reading, where she raised her children. Maria told how she worked in mushroom farms on the outskirts of the city for over a decade. Conditions were hazardous, and she often came, I knew her, and she often came to Make the Road meetings wearing sunglasses inside because her eyes couldn't adjust to indoor lights after working in the dark mushroom houses all day. Just a year earlier, Make the Road initiated a workers' committee, but it faltered because mushroom workers were dispersed among subcontractors, and many lacked legal status, making them vulnerable and hard to organize. So Make the Road abandoned the workers' committee effort and instead incorporated workers' issues into the Comité de Lucha, which dealt with urban quality of life concerns. National immigration policy and wage campaigns became a focus of their weekly meeting. The vulnerable workforces, such as those in mushrooms, took on central importance again during COVID. Mushroom operations were deemed essential, and workers were expected to report to their jobs during the public health emergency, despite unsafe conditions in the enclosed facilities. Yet, as Maria told in her testimonial, neither she nor her children received a stimulus check. The unemployment supplement expired, and the Senate failed to pass a new stimulus bill. Paycheck protection for small businesses was also set to end, and Make the Road acted. Members rallied at the office of the Pennsylvania Republican senator to call for the extension of federal unemployment, small business assistance, and stimulus checks for all. The list of demands reflected the different material circumstances of Make the Road members who have mixed immigration status and different kinds of livelihoods. Some reported to essential jobs, while others were furloughed and were left without income. Some owned small businesses, struggling to remain viable. Make the Road protested senators in the 5 states where it has chapters, and its parent organization coordinated strategy at the national level. Weeks of actions and negotiations won coverage for some people, self-employed people, part-time workers, but not for those without a Social Security number, nor for sub-minimum wage earners. So immigrant households in Reading and Berks turned to charity and to 2 social movement organizations who launched a mutual aid effort to deliver them food and other goods to run their households. Notwithstanding the profound defeat, social movement organizations challenge historical labor hierarchies of documented, undocumented, formal, informal, waged, and tipped. The speaker's disagreement about essential workers manifests the different ways the state acts upon labor and the diverse organizational forms, constituencies, and strategies of labor and social movements in the US. The resulting heterogeneity of material circumstances and identity surely hobbles organizing and solidarity. It's a problem. But when the panelists debated the designation essential, they disagreed about how to articulate class identity and about where leverage and power lie. Those are critical political debates. They spoke from distinct institutional bases. On the one hand, a political party and organized labor, and on the other hand, an NGO. And they championed different actors and tactics. From a Marxist labor anthropology perspective, I saw the creation of difference in the state designations and protections that set in motion uneven labor formation. I saw on-the-ground struggles emerge to act on and protest those developments. The categorization and unequal valorization is precisely what Beverly Silver had in mind when she asked who is cut in and who's left out of state and union protections. Silver emphasized that labor unions the world over organize and represent some sectors and kinds of workers, but neglect others. As a result, many livelihood activities lack union protections. Too often passed over are domestic care and casual workers. All the while, states legitimate, recognize, and assign value to some labors and devalue others. That is, labor is a divided and struggled over social formation. That is, the very categorization of who count as labor is political, as are the alliances and struggle that follow from this designation. If labor scholarship and orthodox Marxism historically focused on the wage at the expense of other livelihood practices, heterogeneous capitalist relations in our century deliver a strong caution to de-center the wage. This has long been the cry from Marxist feminists as well as social movement activists. For Marxist labor anthropologists, the analytical starting point must be capitalism as a totality. All human effort of social reproduction and value production is, in our view, free, unfree, visible, invisible, rural, urban, formal, informal, and so on. This starting point owes a debt to Eric Wolf's writing on social labor. Following Marx, Wolf distinguished work, or the many qualitative different kinds of human endeavor, from the general phenomenon labor. This perspective opens ethnographic inquiry to examine the power-laden processes that mobilize social labor and categorize, differentiate, or unify laborers. It places individual case studies within a larger matrix of power, understanding in Wolf's words that the distribution of capital and labor markets and the resulting differentiation of the labor force locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally are never fixed and stable. This observation about scale is not to be taken for granted. Local and global scales are always already made through interaction. The notion mutual constitution captures this dynamic. Capitalist social relations have always everywhere been mutually constituted and heterogeneous. Contemporary globalization accelerates that tendency. But it's always difficult and unpredictable to translate those social facts into political ones, because power works to fragment the circumstances and experience of working people and the oppressed. Given the tendency of capital to fragment, how are social facts of various livelihood practices translated into political ones? What are the changing forms of organization and disorganization, struggle and acquiescence, alliance and division for working people? If classes of labor are variable, unstable, and in the making, if they express ongoing development of relations of conflict and dependency, how is it possible to think of class politically? The geographer Cindy Katz provides one useful focus through her concepts of topography and counter-topography. Those are a spatialized framework for grasping the unevenness of capitalism and unequal valuation of people entangled with it. Counter-topography refers to how globalization takes shape on the ground in order to work out a situated, but at the same time, scale-jumping, geography-crossing political response. Analytical connections to other places can mark a particular yet common relation to capitalist processes, or the simultaneity of different kinds of disruptions. This perspective enables political possibility, since recognizing the intertwined consequences of global capitalism can encourage and enable new alliances. Sol and Santella, again, sharpen our thinking. They make a distinction, I think this is brilliant actually, between direct relations made by classes for themselves through class consciousness and solidarity, and indirect relations, or the bond between workers around the world that is mediated by capital. So just to conclude, during the pandemic, unevenness played out in stark relief in the Rust Belt city of Reading, Pennsylvania, and the surrounding suburban and rural Berks County. And social movement groups brought questions of labor to the fore in their organizing. Though this surely conveys disadvantage, the set of circumstances, the uneven set of circumstances is not only a liability. Labor is historically and politically constituted. Accordingly, activism against the state, legislative pressure on behalf of immigrants or tip servers, and against capital, chokehold actions and wildcat strikes are compatible and mutually reinforcing strategies for a heterogeneous working class. Different assertions of identity, plans of action, organizational forms are both necessary and appropriate for those undertakings. The task is not to produce homogeneity from unevenness, rather to determine how to take advantage of the unevenness and particular conjunctural combination of social relations. The problem of heterogeneity can be leveraged, since tackling it requires us to apprehend the variegated relations of exploitation, extraction, incorporation, and dispossession of actually existing capital. When the state categorized and divided labor during the pandemic, essential workers stayed on the job and were exposed to sickness and death. Organizers used their exceptional status to assert the worth as essential workers and to plot new forms of protest. Food packers staged wildcats. Advocates for restaurant workers pressured legislators to raise the minimum wage for all and make the road demanded inclusion in state relief. Their experiences of exploitation, marginalization, and disposability speak to the many ways capital extracts value from working people. The categorization of labor underway during COVID attempted to naturalize and institute difference. But our research can expose how these divisions of labor are made, and it can delineate the on-the-ground struggles, alliances, and strategies that can crack open these processes. Finally, the concept of social labor enables very radical questions, since it precisely reunites the never-ending divisions that are the lifeblood of capital. How should we deploy our social labor for collective betterment? And what would it take to realize those aims? How to uncover, in Marx's words, the relational relations among people and between people and nature. Anthropologists perform a critically important service when we detail global capitalism's many fragmented forms and disruptions. But our job does not end there. Fragmentation is a necessary starting point, but it is not an endpoint. Also required is a suturing of those concrete practices, an analysis of their historical and political economic conditions, and the articulation of the relational relations among them. Thank you.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Sharryn, por la exposición tan condensada, tantos debates condensados, tantos conceptos que son parte del bagaje cotidiano con el que trabajamos, articulados y en una presentación consistente. La verdad es que es súper estimulante. Tenemos unos minutitos para preguntas, para intervenciones. Lo vamos a hacer ordenadamente, hay que acercarse a la compu, así que ahora me levantan la mano. ¿Nadie? Yo rompo el hielo. Bueno, bueno. Voy a remitirme a eh, este. Hiciste una referencia muy breve, digamos, en el marco de la etnografía a estas diferenciaciones que pueden remitirse a la legislación del New Deal, ¿sí? A este momento histórico, también como productor de diferenciaciones. Y entonces me recordé de esta noción de los mapas mentales que trabajan en el artículo con August Carbonella. Y la pregunta es, ¿cómo pensás o cómo trabajan digamos, las continuidades y las rupturas en términos históricos en el momento de pensar esta producción de diferenciaciones? ¿Sí? ¿Cómo que recuperamos? Bueno, no sé si es clara, siempre pienso en la traducción y me parece que no sé. Bueno, esa sería mi pregunta. ¿Cómo incorporar lo histórico en la producción de diferenciación?
Okay, if I understand you correctly, then, because I was listening in Spanish, I didn't listen to the interpretation, but I think I understand you correctly. If you look at the current rhetoric and organizing that Donald Trump was doing in this campaign, what he told people to kind of rally working class voters, white, brown, black, but certainly white working class voters, is I'm going to take you back. We're gonna go historically backwards to make America great again. That was his line. We're going to make America great again. And the class map that he was evoking is precisely this New Deal Fordist class map that privileged sectors of the US working class and marginalized others. And those were largely along the lines of race and gender. So he used class maps to articulate a kind of white supremacist, male supremacist imagination along class lines. So in fact, these class maps, as dated as they are, these Fordist class maps coming out of the US New Deal, as dated as they are very politically alive and very effective, because so many people either feel displaced from that set of aspirations or feel that that set of aspirations which never applied to them, so here minority peoples or women, and they want them. They're being told they should want them at the expense of others. And those others who they should be at the expense of are immigrants, hence the immigration policy. So I think those class maps are very alive. And I don't think the left has articulated in any clear way a new aspirational class map. That's one of the many problems of the US left. It is not the only one, but it's one of many. Does that address the question?
Sí, indudablemente. ¿Alguno? ¿Alguna? ¿Alguna?
Ahí, Jaime. Tienes que arrimarte a la computadora.
Arrimate a la compu y portuñol, por favor.
¿Toques inglés?
Vale.
Hi.
Hola.
My name is Jaime, and I came from Brazil. Most of them, I don't speak Spanish, so I ask you a question in English.
Thank you.
And I would like to know a little bit more about your understanding, thinking that we live in countries like Brazil and Argentina, where most of the time, the same question that you pose for us seems like old questions, because most of the time we have unemployment in high levels, we have rural and urban workers, and the migrant and the native workforce. And I would like to know your opinion about the epistemological way of thinking as persons who live in countries like us.
I mean,
because sometimes this kind of position to establish distinctions between workers seems more our questions than the questions of workers themselves.
yeah, I think increasingly that applies to the US as well. I don't think we're that different in that regard from you. I understand that there's a different historical trajectory and the numbers may look different, but we have the same questions. And I think that that's an important thing for us to all sort of embrace, that the anthropologist Susanna Nawrocki has made this kind of declaration, which is provocative and people like to talk about. You know what I'm going to say? That we are all peasants now, that the divide between the kind of multiple livelihood strategies and insecurity that peasants live under is the general condition. And so I think that's a good starting point. And you know, I'm a unionist as well. I'm the vice president of my faculty union, and I'm an activist in social movement organizations. So I'll get to answer it from that perspective rather than a theoretical perspective. In the United States, something interesting has happened in the last several years, which is that the United Automobile Workers Union, so the auto worker sector, has become the most important in numbers organizer union for academic workers. 25% of the UAW membership are college workers, graduate students, adjunct, like part-time college workers, faculty. So in some ways, that's, and obviously that doesn't take into account unemployed and rural. I understand that, but just as a beginning point, that's the kind of model I think that we need to be pursuing. And I want to add that, like, far from making it a less powerful union, I think it's made it more radical and more powerful. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. The UAW in the United States just pulled off the biggest victory in a contract it has in probably 30 years. The biggest pushback in auto against the big automakers. And they did it because they have a very, very outspoken, left-leaning president who came from an opposition slate in the union, who he says himself would not have been elected if it hadn't been for the votes of the academic workers. And then he says, when they went on strike prior to the big strike that happened last year, where they had this historic win, when they were going on these smaller strikes, it was the academic workers who have flexible schedules, maybe they work part-time, who were on the picket lines at these local plants, helping the workers to make their case. And in the Congress, the Mass National Congress, the academic workers use their theoretical know-how to enrich the debate. This is what Sean Fain, the president himself, says. So that's what I mean when I say that it's the heterogeneity is a plus, is an asset. We think of it as a problem. It's a problem, don't get me wrong. We know it's a problem. It is also an asset. And we have to find strategic ways to leverage it. I think the UAW is finding a strategic way to leverage it. And we can do that in different places. And I don't mean that tomorrow we're going to get to one big union like the Wobblies, the Trotskyists want, but these are strategic wins that are that kind of show the way and are consonant with the theory I'm talking about. Yeah, that helps.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was a great question. I appreciate it.
Bien, he vuelto. ¿Alguien más? Quedaron todos. Dale.
Tercera.
Hola.
Gracias, muchas gracias, Sharryn, por tu conferencia. A raíz un poco de la respuesta a la pregunta de Julia Soul, mi pregunta tiene que ver con si has realizado trabajo de campo con esas mismas preguntas con las que fuiste al campo en el momento de la pandemia, más actualmente, y si existe esa reflexión en torno de las nuevas divisiones producidas en ese contexto tan particular de la pandemia, pueden ser observadas de alguna manera, ponderadas en el actual escenario. Con esto quiero decir, ¿cuál es el impacto en esas construcciones desde las y los trabajadores en el presente? ¿Cómo podemos identificar una situación tan dramática y excepcional en las particularidades del hoy? Empezar a pensar el impacto de ese fenómeno en el mundo del trabajo desde una perspectiva antropológica. Gracias.
Gracias. Well, I'm tempted to go back to the university setting as a work setting. Maybe I won't do that. Maybe what I'll say is this. We're about, in the United States, we are about to live this debate profoundly because Trump has said he is going to engage in mass deportation of immigrants. And that's our workforce. So how are social movement groups going to respond? How are unions going to respond? What alliances will they make or not make? Who will they identify as valuable or not valuable? So the same processes are going to happen whereby the state will engage in actions. And in this case, I think the state and capital will confront each other because capital has the interest of keeping workers here, undocumented workers, and the state is saying out. So that will be an interesting dimension to it. But I think we are going to live these very questions. I think we're living them now as people are plotting strategy. I think it has to be the case that, well, I was just at a demonstration 2 days ago that was, and I live in New York City, but Make the Road, my organization in Pennsylvania, is also in New York City. They were there with the unions. So the social movement groups on immigration are there with the unions protesting Trump. I do not think they have yet gotten to a national platform or a full alliance. I don't know that they ever will, but those conversations are happening and they are going to take full force. I don't know if that answers the question.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you.
Viene Hernán. Ya vamos encaminándonos al final, así que piensen
Hola, Hernán.
ahora.
Bueno, ¿cómo estás? Tengo dos preguntas. Una, un poco continuando con lo que preguntó Vero recién, si a partir de este enfoque, ¿cuál es la complejidad, si se puede pensar, que introduce ahora lo que sería el capitalismo de plataformas, en esto de la diferenciación y la fragmentación de la clase trabajadora, si es que lo trabajaste, si es lo que lo pensaste? Y por último, una cuestión más de debates, si desde, digamos, desde el norte global, donde estás pensando y trabajando, si desde allí llegan los debates o qué lecturas tienen respecto de los sures globales, respecto a la antropología del trabajo, ¿no? Que aquí en Argentina, en Brasil, en México y en otros países de América Latina tiene un desarrollo bien importante. Bueno, de todos los debates que tenemos aquí, ¿qué es lo que llega allí, digamos, al norte global?
Yeah.
Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you. About platform workers, I don't have much to say. It's not something I study in depth. I should, but I don't. But I'll say that the kind of fragmentation that is happening globally, right? So that the kind of fragmentation I'm talking about, which is regionally positioned, that's not true for platform workers. The fragmentation is global in scope, right? And I think that presents really interesting questions. I don't have the answers to. Really interesting questions about the international scale, which of course we all know about the importance of that international scale, which I haven't really dealt with in my work on these questions. I think that Julia, for example, does a much better job of those kinds of questions in her work. So I'll say that. And then I'll just say that I'm quite influenced. This is at a case study scale. I was quite influenced by the work of the work on from Argentina on the organizing of casual workers and the ways that unions have incorporated casual or I'm losing the word for it, but casual workers and that kind of organizing strategy. I'm very influenced by that in thinking about how to envision putting together the heterogeneity. And I've also, this is dated, but I've also was very influenced by the kind of marginal mass arguments back in the day. And the idea that there's this kind of, that capital creates this kind of disposability. So I thought through those arguments very fully to arrive at where we've arrived in the Anthropology of Labor. So those are two things that I would say about Global South theory. But you can tell me what you think I'm missing that you think would enrich it, and I would appreciate that.
Gracias.
Okay, thank you.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Lorena y mi reflexión se vincula más bien a una, quizás, es una reflexión en relación a la pandemia como evento crítico y como crisis sistémica, que me parece que dentro de la esfera del capital generó, me parece como que el capital es mucho más rápido en aplicar ajustes y generar diferenciación dentro de los trabajadores, y nosotros, pensándolo como militante y como sindicalista, digamos, somos más lentos a la hora de reaccionar a esos eventos más críticos. Entonces, si bien aquí, por ejemplo, hubo cierto tipo de organización dentro de algunos sectores esenciales, como por ejemplo los médicos o el personal de salud, los reclamos no excedieron lo económico corporativo, si se quiere, no pasaron de ahí, digamos, no llegaron a un momento político de mayor organización como podría haber generado un evento de tal magnitud como la pandemia. Me parece que en el caso de que vos presentaste, en el trabajo de campo que comentaste, parece que eso se logró con estas organizaciones, con estas dos organizaciones que lograron cómo trascender un poco, digamos, lo más sectorial, si se quiere, ¿no? Y eso yo no sé si tiene que ver con la composición de clase o con el origen nacional de los actores por los cuales estas organizaciones, digamos, reclamaban ciertos derechos. ¿Se entiende la pregunta?
No, no, no precisamente porque estoy escuchando en español. Dime otra vez.
No se escucha.
Oh. ¿Me escuché? ¿Sí?
Estamos muteadas.
Yo no creo que...
Julia. ¿Se habrá caído? Sí.
Y si lo ponemos en el idioma
Sí,
original,
podemos poner en...
para
Ahí está.
la final.
Tenemos problemas con la intérprete.
No está
Ok.
escuchando la traducción. Ah, Sharryn no está escuchando. ¿Quién no está escuchando?
Y a ella no se la escucha tampoco.
Veníamos pisteando. Está en la periferia.
Bien.
Hello. I can hear you.
No.
The fact that I didn't hear
No.
you wasn't a problem of technology. I hadn't
A ella
put...
no se la
Ahora
escucha.
sí, dice Fernanda.
Pero a ella no se
No,
la
I
escucha.
know.
Ni a
A ver.
Fernanda.
Yeah, you can explain that to them. I just want her to repeat the question.
Lo pongo en inglés.
A ver. Decirle que la escuchamos.
Ahora te escuchamos, Sharryn, a ver.
¿Me escuchas?
Sí.
I can hear you.
Ah, que repite la pregunta. Lore.
Ok.
Pero poné el español de nuevo.
Lo que pasa es que yo no tenía puesto la interpretación. Sí. Sí.
Ok. Vuelvo a hacer la pregunta.
Porque entiendo perfectamente, bueno, entiendo bastante
Ok.
bien el español. Lo que pasa es que no entendí la pregunta.
Vuelvo a hacer la pregunta entonces. Pensando en la pandemia como evento que irrumpe, digamos, y transforma y genera una crisis sistémica muy profunda, ¿no? Lo pensaba esta reflexión en tanto militante también. Y cómo el capital aprovecha ese evento disruptivo, digamos, para generar más diferenciación entre tipos de trabajadores. Y lo pienso como la rapidez del capital para ello y la lentitud de nosotros como trabajadores para responder a esos ajustes y a esas diferenciaciones cada vez más crecientes. Yo lo veo en algunos sectores aquí en Argentina. Entonces, yo lo que te pregunta y lo que encontraba es una diferencia con el caso que presentaste, porque en el caso que presentaste hay dos organizaciones que inician, digamos, ciertos reclamos a partir de esas diferenciaciones que se buscan implementar. Y lo que te preguntaba es si esos reclamos son parte, digamos, de una organización de la clase, como clase, o están pensados más desde del origen nacional de quienes van a desde quienes necesitan recibir esos derechos que se les quitaron. O ambas. Acá lo que vi en Argentina es que sí hubo un intento de organización entre algunos sectores esenciales, como el sector de salud durante la pandemia, pero que no pasaba lo económico corporativo, digamos, no se podía trascender de lo económico corporativo. Entonces, digo, ahí yo lo que sí reflexiono es cómo la lentitud de las organizaciones, de la militancia en, digamos, reaccionar a estos eventos tan disruptivos, a diferencia del capital, ¿no? Que siempre está preparado. Gracias.
Thank you. I do understand the question. I appreciate it. I'll say that to the particular question of was it class or national organizing, or was the class question or the national question the prevailing question? It was both. In this case, it was both, because the workers who were essential and yet still cut out of state support, or not essential and then left to impoverishment without state support, unlike the other workers, were both targeted for their immigration status, but also the kinds of work they did that were invisible, that weren't compensated. Like some of them who had legal status just made too little money to qualify for the benefits. So it was both. And maybe where you're headed with that question is, that therefore it really was a potent kind of political moment, precisely because it was both things at the same time. There was gender involved too, because of the issue of care work that people were aware of. So it was a moment in which the kinds of questions we often find dispersed were condensed in one struggle around covering uncovered workers, right? Essential or non-essential, those who had to report or didn't. It is true that it was reactive. It is true that it was reactive. And so in this sense, yes, you're right. Capital was quick, and the social movement groups and the unions reacted. True. But what happened, the dynamic that happened here was that those cleavages of who was covered, who had immigration status, who wasn't covered, were already the concerns of a pretty significant national scale immigration movement in this country, where immigration groups were already organized, were already in coalition, and were already fighting for immigration reform, legal immigration reform, to incorporate those without status into a legal structure, to be recognized as legal workers and occupants of the United States, residents of the United States. But they lost. They lost. That's the thing. After the pandemic, and after this fight on incorporating them into that stimulus bill, they took that loss and said, okay, we need at the national level, national labor reform, national immigration reform. And they lost that struggle too. So it isn't so much that they didn't wage the battle, they didn't win the battle. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I think you're asking me.
Gracias.
Okay.
Bueno, tenemos...
Las preguntas en el chat.
Ah, bueno. ¿Cuántas?
Fíjate en los...
¿Una pregunta?
Sí.
Ok. Bueno, tenemos una pregunta más que voy a leer. ¿Cómo pueden los sindicatos crear estrategias de acercamiento con los trabajadores precarios de los servicios poco calificados y fragmentados como en los restaurantes? En el mismo contexto laboral, ¿cómo puede un investigador o investigadora encontrar estrategias para analizar las condiciones de los trabajadores en estos sectores? Estrategia de investigación en sectores fragmentados y con baja calificación, con poca calificación, y bueno, estrategias sindicales en todo caso. Entiendo que la pregunta es sobre tu experiencia.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand, but let me ask a question. Are you asking the question, on the one hand, you have in one organization unionized workers, and on the other hand, somewhere else are these unskilled restaurant workers? Is that the question, and how to research both of them?
No. En realidad hablamos del mismo grupo de trabajadores fragmentados y no calificados. Okay. Ponen como ejemplo los trabajadores de restaurantes. ¿Cuáles son las estrategias de acercamiento de los sindicatos y cuáles las de los investigadores? O sea, como parte de la cuestión de organización de la clase y después las propias estrategias que ponemos en juego para llegar a esos trabajadores como investigadores.
Okay, I think I understand. I'll in the United States context, there are unionized restaurant workers. Those exist. And the problem is that a large segment of the restaurant workers or food workers are in like fast food, McDonald's, Burger King, the fast food industry. Those are not unionized. The strategy that unions have used in the United States, and they're difficult to organize because they're dispersed, and the ownership structure of these organizations are such that their employer might be different. Some employers are employees of McDonald's, others are employers of private owners of individual McDonald's locations, if that's clear. So it's been very hard to organize them. Plus they don't stay long, plus they're young. And the strategy that unions have used is to build a social movement outside of the workplace proper to pressure individual states to create living wage ordinances. So not a contract with an employer, but pressuring the state, not the federal state, but the individual, like New York State, or to raise the minimum wage. And in New York State, this won, it worked, or to create a living wage. These are really good strategies because it builds a broader based social movement around wages that doesn't depend on organizing a workplace. And the unions have been in the lead of this. It's a broad-based social movement, but the unions have been in the lead. So that has been an effective strategy. And speaking to the question of unemployed workers, and when you raise the minimum wage at the state level, you're bringing in lots of people otherwise. So that's a good strategy, I think. And I think it's been effective in the United States in specific places, not in the, because our federal minimum wage is still very low. If I'm being clear, I hope I am. And then as a researcher, how I have I think, I don't know what the configurations are in your particular places, but because of the relationship between social movements and unions over the last 2 decades on these issues, I can be in a place where there is both union action and social movement group action in one place. Like I could have studied this fight for this living wage, and that would have brought me both into the union sector and the low wage sector. So I don't know if they're comparable. I don't know where you're doing your research or where the question applies to, but I don't know if there are comparable places of confluence, like, or if there are unions that are doing the kind of putting together of those people, but that's what I would look for. Now that you say it, I think it's a very interesting question. I didn't do it consciously. Because in Pennsylvania, where I'm doing my research, the unions have receded from, there's been enough deindustrialization and job loss that the unions have receded. But these social movement groups that I've been studying have been at the core of these other kinds of minimum wage struggles that have enabled me to see both kinds of groups in action. So I guess, reflecting backwards, you're asking me a question that makes me reflect backwards, and it makes it sound intentional. For me, it wasn't intentional. I lucked into it. But I guess if somebody asked me the question, how are you going to study these groups together? I would say precisely this. Look for spaces wherever they are. And I feel like I can think of in examples of this for Argentina, of stuff that I've read where you're talking about this, like organizing of casual workers, street sweepers, or what have you, in the context of unionization. It's exactly that kind of confluence, or any kind of organizing of garbage pickers in India, for example, something like that. That's how I would think about it, thinking retroactively. Oh, do you want to answer the mental maps question? Claudia has.
Ah, sí, sí, la había visto. Bien, la digo para todos. Bueno, en resumen, es una pregunta sobre esta categoría de mapas mentales heredados que trae Sharryn. Sí, bueno, es esa la categoría.
I took it from Denning's work. And you can see that reference. I think it's in the article you read of mine, but Julia in her final chapter in the Marxism and the Social Movements book that she's edited also makes reference to it. And when I rewrote some of this work for this chapter, I referred more to Julia's work than to Denning's work because she's done a little bit more with it. So I recommend that chapter, and Julia can share it with you.
Quieren ir a almorzar. No, igual hay que responderle al compañero o la compañera que hizo la pregunta por el chat. Así que, muy brevemente, nosotros repusimos la pregunta por los mapas mentales de clase del texto de Sharryn y August, porque ellos planteaban ahí una categoría de mapas mentales que nos parecía muy interesante por lo abarcativa, porque recuperaba no solamente supuestos teóricos y conceptuales con los cuales se construye la categoría de clase en investigación social muchas veces, sino también esta suerte de representaciones, dimensiones identitarias y tipos de aspiraciones y perspectivas del mundo que construyen los mismos trabajadores y en función de las cuales se operan muchas de estas clasificaciones y diferenciaciones. Entonces reponíamos esa categoría de mapas mentales como una herramienta heurística para poder avanzar en esto de, bueno, cuáles son los vínculos o cuáles son las relaciones que tenemos que mirar para poder pensar una categoría de clase contemporánea, digamos, que pueda dar cuenta de esta diversidad contemporánea. Ese sería más o menos nuestro trabajo con esa categoría. Bueno, terminamos. Entonces, Sharryn, muchísimas gracias por estos momentos, por esta conferencia. Realmente es súper estimulante. Nos quedan 2 días de trabajo, seguramente vamos a estar volviendo sobre ella todo el tiempo. Muchas gracias a CLACSO, gracias a quien esta conferencia fue traducida y además va a quedar registrada. Gracias a quienes se conectaron, a quienes la estuvieron siguiendo virtualmente. Bueno, yo un gustazo, estoy re contenta, así que espero, ay, sí, que puedas
Thank you,
venir algún
everybody.
día, Sharryn. Acá estamos ya entendiendo. Estamos en una situación un poco ahogada de financiamiento, pero vamos. Ahí vamos. Bueno, cerramos. Muchas gracias entonces a todos y a todas.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your questions.